Spotlight is a production of CTNY, the Catholic Television Network of Youngstown. It seeks to spotlight people, places, and events from around the Diocese of Youngstown that promote the new gospel of joy called for by Pope Francis. Your program host is Father James Korda.
Hello and welcome to Spotlight. I'm Father Jim Korda. During this series, we're going to celebrate the 75th anniversary of the Diocese of Youngstown. And joining me in today's show is Msgr David Rhodes. Welcome to our show.
Glad to be here.
You know, when we talk about the anniversary of the Diocese of Youngstown, we have that number 75. But as we were talking prior to the taping, the history really goes back much further. Can you expound on that a little bit?
Yes, we really commemorate in a way the 200th anniversary of the establishment of Catholicism in northeastern Ohio in the years 1817 and 1818, when the Dominican priest, Father Edward Fenwick, who subsequently became the Bishop of Cincinnati, was the apostle to Ohio and established missions. And in the northeastern section of Ohio, it was here in our diocese, in the area, territory of the Youngstown Diocese, that Catholicism was first established in Dungannon and in Canton at St. John's Parish. And Father Fenwick records that he visited these places in 1817, 1818, and that's when Catholicism was established here. So I think we should be proud that it's not just 75 years of the Diocese of Youngstown, but it's 200 years of Catholicism in this part of the country and in this part of the state.
You know, it's interesting as you were talking about that, I've often wondered, why did he find his way to Dungannon? What brought him to Dungannon? Would it have been a populated area? Would it have been because of the canal? What would have been a reason that he would have stopped in Dungannon and then gone on to Canton?
Yes, well, in 1816, he, together with a group of Dominicans, had established a priory down in Somerset, Ohio, where a German farmer by the name of Ditto, his last name was Ditto, had settled and had requested that a priest come and minister to the Catholics who were settling there, had settled there. And so he was appointed as a Dominican to be the missionary to the Ohio. So he tells of how he came on horseback through the wilderness and through the underdeveloped country, which Ohio was, up through the north, visited Wayne County to the west of us, and then came and visited Stark County and Columbiana County. And there were pockets of Catholics in Columbiana County, mostly Irish immigrants who had settled there, just a handful. Same thing in Canton, but mostly German and French immigrants. And he was charged with ministering to the people of Ohio, and it was in 1817, 1818 that he happened to come upon those places.
And let's talk about the state of Ohio. We know that Cincinnati is the metropolitan, it's the archdiocese, and obviously the oldest. Talk about that historically, about the creation of those dioceses in the state.
Well, the very first diocese in the United States, of course, was the Diocese of Baltimore. And apart from New Orleans, which was French, and California, which was Spanish, it was the only diocese until 1808, when there were 4 new ones established. One in Boston, New York, and Philadelphia. The 4th one, interestingly, was Bardstown, Kentucky, which is located near Louisville, Kentucky, and which is now Louisville, Kentucky Archdiocese. But what had happened was many Catholics from the Maryland area, where Fenwick was from, his family was from there, had migrated to Kentucky. And there was a sizable group of Catholics in Kentucky around the early 1800s. So in 1808, Bardstown has made this diocese, which includes the whole Northwest Territory of Ohio, of the country, including Ohio, Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota, and that was all one diocese. And the only priests that they had were this group of Dominicans who had come from Maryland, Father Fenwick being one of them, and that's where they settled, and that's how he happened to be appointed to come here.
You know, it's interesting, in our last few minutes of our first segment, we call Fenwick the Apostle of Ohio. Go back to that root word of apostle. Why is it so important that he's got that nomenclature?
Well, of course, the apostle, the Greek, means one who is sent, as the 12 apostles were sent to proclaim the gospel and the good news. And so he appropriately was sent by then Archbishop Carroll, or Bishop Carroll, John Carroll, or whoever was the Bishop of Bardstown. His name was Flaget. He was a Frenchman, also a Dominican, and he sent Fenwick up into Ohio to be the missionary to Ohio, and we give him the title of apostle, which he certainly was, when you consider the times in which he lived.
Right. Let's talk briefly about the beginnings of the Diocese of Youngstown in 1943. We know that Cleveland was the parent diocese. Why did they create a diocese here in Youngstown?
Well, mainly because of the growth. That was, Cleveland was established in 1847. In 1847, Ohio was divided into two dioceses, Cincinnati in the south, Cleveland in the north. And then later, in 1910, Toledo was cut off from Cleveland for the western part of the state. And by 1943, which is almost a century later, the population in our 6 counties of northeastern Ohio was almost around 150,000 people. So, and it was growing rapidly. And there were rumors, there had been rumors ever since early 1900s that Youngstown would be a diocese. When St. Columba Cathedral was built in 1902, there was the big rumor, oh, it's going to be a cathedral. Well, that didn't happen for another 40-some years. But, and then later on, there was always a rumor that Youngstown will be a diocese. By 1943, it was really necessary because Cleveland was quite large at that time. We're
going to talk about those beginnings of a young diocese 75 years ago in just a moment, but we're going to take a quick break.
Okay.
So please stay with us. We'll be right back. In 1847, the parish of St. Columba was established. It would eventually become the Cathedral Church when the diocese was formed in 1943. It was the first parish in the city of Youngstown and in all Mahoning County. The first church built in 1851 was to be on land in Briar Hill that was donated by David Todd, who became the first and so far only governor from Mahoning County. A second church was built in 1864, and in 1897, the third church was erected on the site of the present cathedral. A tragic fire destroyed the cathedral in 1954, but by 1958, a new cathedral was dedicated, which serves Catholics today. Congratulations, Catholic Diocese, for celebrating 75 years with pride in the past and faith in the future. Miles from the first Catholic parish in all of Ohio, in a place called Canton, Catholics gathered in 1817 to celebrate Mass with Father Fenwick. Because of limited building space, the Mass was held outdoors under a huge oak tree. The spot near the present Church of St. John the Baptist, which was established in 1823 as the second oldest parish in the Diocese of Youngstown. The oak tree grew there until 1906, when it was struck by lightning. To preserve it, the parishioners took the wood and carved a chair out of it, which remains in the church today. In 2012, St. John the Baptist was elevated to a basilica. Congratulations, Catholic Diocese, for celebrating 75 years with pride in the past and faith in the future. Welcome back to our show. I'm talking with Father David Rhodes, celebrating the 75th anniversary of the Diocese of Youngstown. You know, in our first segment, we talked a lot about the beginnings, really, of Catholicism in Ohio and beyond. Let's talk and focus our thoughts now on the beginnings of the diocese here in Youngstown. We talked briefly about the growth of the local church and the creation of the need to create a diocese. Let's talk about the early beginnings and our first bishop coming from our mother diocese of Cleveland. Why was that significant?
Well, I think it was significant that it gave, my understanding is that creating a new diocese in Youngstown, and especially appointing a man like Bishop James McFadden, who was very personable and had a reputation for being very congenial, very affable, it brought the role of the bishop, I think, closer to the people, and gave the office of bishop and the presence of the diocese a more personal touch. One of the excellent sources of that we have is our former Bishop James Malone, who gave an interview to the Catholic Exponent at the time of the 50th anniversary of our diocese. Bishop Malone, when he was ordained a priest in 1945, was appointed to the cathedral, would have dinner every day with Bishop Malone, with Bishop McFadden, got to know him very well, and certainly could reflect a good insight into the kind of bishop that he was. And he tells us in that interview of how personable he was, how he liked to reminisce, how he was present at everything. Prior to that, a diocese like Cleveland was huge, far-flung. It would be difficult for a bishop to be present at so many events, whereas Bishop McFadden had this ability to relate nicely to people and to be present to them at ever so many occasions. And that was the gift that I think he brought, as I understand it, and the quality that he gave to the new diocese.
Let's go on to the Walsh era. Obviously, he came from Charleston, South Carolina, so he was from outside of the state.
Right.
And what would he have brought to Youngstown, and why would he have come from so far?
Well, the word is, first of all, he had a very important role in the what was then the Bishops' Conference of the United States. It was called the Catholic Welfare Conference. And he played a very important role of leadership in that group. So, and he had been Bishop of Charleston, South Carolina for 22 years. So, why that he was chosen, who knows? I mean, we don't know that. But he certainly brought experience, and the diocese was growing rapidly. So he brought it was during his and Bishop McFadden's time. Their tenures as bishop corresponded to exactly the first 25 years of our diocese. And in that period of 25 years, the population doubled, from going from about 150,000 to almost 300,000 people, Catholics. And there was practically tremendous growth. And certainly he brought a quality of leadership that enabled him to oversee all that.
And of course, you were very close with Bishop Malone. You worked very closely with him in the chancery.
Yeah.
Let's talk about some of those recollections that you have of Bishop Malone.
Well, I worked there for 10 years in the 70s, from 1969 to 79. It was exciting years because the Vatican Council Second Vatican Council had just ended in 1965, right after I was ordained. Bishop Malone was one of the youngest bishops at that council. He attended all the sessions. Right after that council ended, in January of 1966, he was appointed apostolic administrator of the diocese because of Bishop Walsh's illness. And he was in charge of seeing to the implementation of Vatican II. And my greatest memory of Bishop Malone was the competency with which he did that. He was an intelligent, bright leader, He could be difficult to work with, but the other side of the coin was that you learned a lot from him. And so I have great memories of the experience I had. It so happened that Bishop Malone, during those years, was chairman of the Bishops' Committee on the Liturgy. And that was the area that the church was changing mostly in the 70s. The liturgy, the introduction of the new order of Mass, and all the reform of the sacraments. Bishop Malone was chairman of that Bishops' Committee overseeing that, and I had the responsibility, serving in the chancery with him, of implementing the introduction of those rites, the study days for priests, and presentation of these issues to the people through homilies and so on. So it was a very exciting time.
Yeah.
And I have great memories of those days.
And in our last few minutes of our middle segment now, how have you seen the diocese grow, but also change in the years that you've been part of the diocese?
Well, I think you can divide our 75 years into 3 25-year segments very conveniently, both in terms of the tenures of the bishops. Bishop Walsh and McFadden, the first 25 years. Bishop Malone's tenure as bishop corresponds almost exactly to the next 25 years, from 1968 to 1995. And during that period, it wasn't the growth of numbers in terms of Catholic schools, institutions, parishes. It was more the growth of reform of the church through the documents of Vatican II. Extraordinary things, particularly involvement of the lay people, involvement of the baptized in the work of the church and ministry of the church. That was the big thing for the second period. And in the last 25 years, of course, has been difficult in that we've had 2 fine bishops, in Bishop Tobin and Bishop Murray, but they've had to deal with the declining population, the decline in numbers of vocations to priesthood and religious life, and so we've had to address a new kind of church, more like what Bishop Fenwick faced in the very early days, with a shortage of priests and challenges that he faced.
We're going to talk more about that in a moment, but we're going to take a quick break.
Okay.
Stay with us. We'll be right back. The Catholic Diocese of Youngstown was established on May 15, 1943. 2018 marks the 75th anniversary of the diocese. There are 6 counties which make up the Diocese of Youngstown: Ashtabula, Columbiana, Mahoning, Portage, Stark, and Trumbull. There are 5 other dioceses in the state of Ohio, Cincinnati being the oldest, Cleveland, Youngstown's mother diocese, Columbus, Steubenville, and Toledo. Youngstown is the smallest in terms of area, and the second smallest in terms of population, yet it has the 3rd highest percentage of people identifying themselves as Catholics. Congratulations, Catholic Diocese, for celebrating 75 years with pride in the past and faith in the future. It was in Dungannon, Ohio, in Columbiana County, that the first group of Catholics settled. St. Philip Neri, the first parish in all northern Ohio, was founded in 1817 under the title of St. Paul's Settlement. It was to visit this settlement that Father Edward Fenwick, the Apostle of Ohio, made his first trip to northern Ohio. 4 years later, Cincinnati was chosen as the see city in the state of Ohio, and Fenwick was selected as the first bishop. Today, St. Philip Neri remains the oldest parish in the Diocese of Youngstown, but it is also one of the smallest. Congratulations, Catholic Diocese, for celebrating 75 years with pride in the past and faith in the future. Welcome back to Spotlight. I'm talking with Monsignor David Rhodes, and we're celebrating the 75th anniversary of the Diocese of Youngstown. You know, one of the highlights of my priesthood was my first assignment, and that was with you, and that was your first pastorate at St. Joe's in Canton.
Yes.
And talk briefly about that beginning for you as your first pastorate, what that was like, and the kind of church that we found ourselves in.
Well, that was, of course, back in 1979, and I had been a priest 12 years. In those days, a priest usually served as an assistant pastor or associate pastor in a parish for about 10, 12 years before he became a pastor. It's totally different now. So I remember telling Bishop Malone that I wanted to serve in the chancery. I was willing to serve there for 10 years, but then I wanted to be a pastor. To me, that was the goal of being a diocesan priest. And so I was privileged to be appointed to St. Joseph's Parish in Canton, and you became my associate. And it was an exciting time. I'll never forget my first days there, being very excited about this new mission that I had, and could I do it, and then implementing changes that needed to be done at that parish and in all the parishes that came out of the Second Vatican Council. So I have fond memories of that. Yeah.
Let's go back a little further than that. Talk about your home parish, which we know is Immaculate Conception in Ravenna, but then there's Roots in other places, and talk briefly about that.
Well, I'm a son of the Immaculate Conception Parish in Ravenna. That's where I grew up, and that's where I celebrated my first Mass in 1965, but I've always considered myself a grandson of St. Joseph Parish in Randolph-Suffield. That's one of the oldest parishes in the diocese, going back to 1832. And my ancestors were among some of the founders of that parish, on both my mother and my father's side. When I say I'm a grandson of the parish, I mean that all four of my grandparents grew up there. They're buried there. And so I feel a part of that history, and it's a very interesting history.
Yeah. We did a spot about St. Joseph in Mogador, and we know that it was really the first parish founded in Portage County, but also its school is significant, and the Lord Shrine. Talk about the school.
Well, the school is reputed to be the oldest Catholic school west of the Allegheny Mountains. Now, I don't know if you can prove that, but it's always said, because it was begun in 1832. In fact, they built the school a couple of years before they built a church. And it's also interesting that they called it an English Catholic school, because though they were predominantly German and French, as my ancestors were, they wanted to be American, and they wanted to identify as English-speaking. And it so happens that my great-great-grandfather, his name was Joseph Schrader. He was an immigrant from Oldenburg in Germany in the north. He was the first school teacher there. And so I'm kind of proud of that. And that school's still in existence, still going. And the other interesting thing about it is we used to take for granted that nuns would be in schools. Well, the nuns never went to that school until 50-some years later, when the Sisters of Notre Dame came from Cleveland to teach in that school. So for the first 50-some years of its existence, it was staffed by lay people. Of course, a one-room school, there's probably only one teacher, but I think we need to remember that. That too is similar to what we have now.
Yeah. In your many years as a diocesan priest, have there been any particular person that has influenced or inspired you over the years, whether it's in your vocation or as a leader in the church? Anyone that stands out, or any persons that stand out that you'd like to share with us?
That's hard to answer, because certainly preeminent would be my parents and my family. They were extraordinary influence, just living the faith as they did. certainly going to a Catholic school. I was taught by Dominican sisters. They had made an impact. And then I could name priests and who also encouraged me. And so it's hard to answer that by naming any one person. I couldn't do that.
Sure. You know, over our conversations, we've talked briefly about some of those changes that have really affected our diocesan church, but also the church in the United States and perhaps even around the world. One of the things that we experience is what we call fewer priests situation. What has been your experience? Of course, when you were first ordained, there was a plethora of diocesan priests. Now those numbers are much smaller. In your experience and also in your thought, why is that, and what can we look forward to in the future?
Well, first I would want to say that I've met some of the young men studying for the priesthood, and I'm impressed with the quality of the men that I've met, and I just trust that we are certainly, our diocese, I understand, is doing, in terms of numbers, is doing as well as anybody else in this part of the world. So I'm just confident and trustful that will continue. It will be a different way of ministering to people with fewer priests, but we'll continue to do it. And there are a lot of reasons that we could address. A married clergy, the possibility of ordination of women, certainly the diaconate. I think the church needs to be open to those and other possibilities.
And just in closing, we know that you were very instrumental in coming up with the diocesan theme for the 75th anniversary. What was that all about?
With pride in the past, I don't know. When I have nothing to do, I like to imagine things. So I don't know how I came up with that. Okay. But
and faith in the future. Let's talk briefly about that.
Well, there always has to be faith in the future. I mean, look at what when Bishop Fenwick became the Bishop of Cincinnati in 1821 as the Apostle of Ohio. There were 6 priests for the whole Ohio plus that he had as a diocese, and they were all Dominicans. One of them was his nephew. So look what he faced, and yet talk about the mustard seed. Growing, being the smallest of seeds, but growing into a great shrub or bush. And we just have to live on confident and trusting that will continue to be the case.
Well, Father David Rhodes, thank you so much for sharing your time with us, but also your expertise and your wealth of knowledge about the history of the diocese and also Catholicism here in Northeastern Ohio.
Okay,
thank you so much.
Thank you.
And thank you for being with us. Have a good day, and God be with you.
Spotlight has been a production of CTNY, the Catholic Television Network of Youngstown. Your program host was Father James Korda.